The winter of 1867 came down hard on the New Mexico territory. Samuel Garrett stood on his cabin porch and watched the sky turn gray and heavy with snow. He was a rancher, a simple man who lived alone on the edge of Apache lands. His small ranch sat in a valley surrounded by mountains that now wore white caps like old men in winter hats. Samuel had built his life here 5 years ago after the war ended. He raised cattle and a few horses. He fixed fences and mended roofs. He lived a quiet life far from towns and people. His nearest neighbor was 10 miles away. The Apache tribes lived in the hills beyond his property, and Samuel had always been careful to respect their land and their ways. The snow started falling on a Tuesday morning. At first it was just light flakes dancing in the wind, but by afternoon the snowfall became thick and heavy. Samuel brought his horses into the barn and made sure his cattle had shelter near the canyon walls. He chopped extra firewood and stacked it by his door. He filled buckets with water from the well before it could freeze. He knew this storm would be bad. For 3 days and 3 nights, the snow fell without stopping. The wind howled like wolves outside his cabin. Samuel kept his fire burning and waited. He had enough food stored for winter: dried beef, beans, flour, and coffee. He had blankets and warm clothes. He would be fine. But he worried about travelers who might be caught in the storm. On the 4th day, the snow finally stopped. The world outside was white and silent. Snowdrifts rose higher than a man's head against the north side of his cabin. The temperature dropped so low that water froze in minutes. Samuel's breath came out in thick white clouds. He put on his heavy coat and went outside to check on his animals. The horses were restless but healthy in the barn. His cattle had huddled together in their sheltered spot and survived the storm. Samuel felt grateful. Many ranchers would lose animals in a winter like this. He spent the morning breaking ice in water troughs and feeding his livestock. The work was hard in the deep snow. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Samuel sat by his fire. He made himself a simple dinner of beans and cornbread. He drank hot coffee and listened to the wind. The cabin was warm, but outside the temperature kept falling. He thought about the Apache people in the hills. Winter was hard for everyone on the frontier. Around 9 o'clock, Samuel heard something strange. At first he thought it was just the wind, but then he heard it again, a sound like knocking on wood. He sat up straight and listened carefully. There it was again, definitely knocking on his door. Samuel's heart started beating faster. Visitors at night in winter were unusual and often meant trouble. He stood up slowly and walked to his gun rack. He took down his rifle and checked that it was loaded, with the rifle in one hand. He moved quietly to the door. The knocking came again. Harder this time, but also weaker, like someone using their last strength. Samuel took a deep breath and called out, "Who's there?" No answer came, just more knocking, Samuel thought quickly. If it was a trap, the person would have answered to make him open the door. If someone needed help, they might be too tired or cold to speak. He made his decision. He set his rifle against the wall but kept it within reach. Then he lifted the wooden bar that locked his door and pulled it open. Cold air rushed in like a living thing. 2 figures stood in his doorway, covered in snow and ice. For a moment, Samuel couldn't tell what he was seeing. Then he realized they were women. 2 Apache women, and they were huge. Both stood taller than Samuel himself, who was nearly 6 feet. Their faces were dark with frostbite, their lips blue with cold. They looked at him with eyes that showed both fear and desperate hope. One of the women tried to speak, but her teeth chattered too hard. She raised one hand as if asking for mercy or help. Samuel saw that her fingers were wrapped in bloody rags. The other woman swayed on her feet like she might fall down any second. Both wore traditional Apache clothing that was now torn and frozen stiff. Samuel made his choice in an instant. "Come in, quickly," he said. Stepping back and gesturing them inside, the women stumbled forward into the warm cabin. Samuel closed the door fast behind them to keep out the freezing air. He guided them to his fireplace and helped them sit down. They collapsed near the fire, shaking violently. Samuel moved fast. He threw more wood on the fire to make it hotter. He grabbed blankets from his bed and wrapped them around the women's shoulders. He filled his kettle with water and set it to boil. The women sat huddled together, their eyes watching him but too exhausted to show much emotion. While the water heated, Samuel looked at his unexpected guests more carefully. They were indeed extraordinarily tall and powerfully built. They were probably sisters, he thought, because they looked so similar. Both had long black hair frozen into icy ropes. Their clothes were ripped in places, showing skin red with cold and exposure. They had been traveling for days, maybe weeks, through the worst winter storm in years, when the water boiled. Samuel made a weak broth from beef and salt. He knew that starving people couldn't eat heavy food right away. He poured the hot broth into 2 cups and handed them to the women. "Drink slowly," he said, making a slow motion with his hand. They understood and sipped the hot liquid carefully. The warmth of the cabin began to work on them. Their shaking became less violent. Color started to return to their faces. Samuel heated more water and soaked clean cloths in it. "Let me see your hands," he said gently to the first woman. She hesitated, then held out her hands. He unwrapped the bloody rags and saw deep cuts and severe frostbite. He cleaned the wounds carefully and wrapped them in fresh bandages. As he worked, Samuel wondered about their story. How did 2 Apache women end up alone in a blizzard? How did they get separated from their people? Where were they trying to go? But these questions could wait. Right now they needed warmth, food, and rest. Everything else would come later. The second woman's hands were in better condition, but her feet were badly frostbitten. Samuel heated stones in the fire, wrapped them in cloth, and placed them near her feet to slowly warm them. He had learned this trick during the war. Warming frozen flesh too quickly could cause terrible damage. By midnight, both women were finally warm and stable. Samuel made them eat more broth and some soft bread. They ate slowly, their eyes never leaving him. He could see questions in their faces. Why was he helping them? What did he want in return? Samuel understood their suspicion. Relations between settlers and Apache were often violent and filled with mistrust. "You're safe here," Samuel said quietly. Not sure if they understood English. "You can rest tonight. Nobody will hurt you." He pointed to his small guest room, a tiny space with a narrow bed that he used for storage. He quickly cleared out boxes and laid down blankets to make 2 sleeping areas on the floor. The women looked at each other, seemed to have a silent conversation, then nodded. They stood up slowly, still wrapped in blankets, and moved to the small room. Samuel closed the door to give them privacy. He returned to his main room and sat by the fire. He kept his rifle close, not because he feared the women, but because he knew that if soldiers or other settlers discovered he was sheltering Apache, there could be serious trouble. Outside, the wind continued to howl. The temperature dropped even lower, but inside Samuel Garrett's cabin, 2 desperate women slept in warmth and safety for the first time in many frozen days and nights. Samuel stayed awake, feeding the fire and thinking about what tomorrow might bring. Samuel woke up before sunrise, just as he always did. The fire had burned down to glowing coals during the night. He stood up from his chair by the hearth, stretched his stiff back, and added fresh wood to bring the flames back to life. The cabin was cold but not freezing. Outside the window, darkness still covered the land. He moved quietly. Not wanting to wake his guests too early, he put coffee on to boil and started preparing breakfast. Samuel was not used to cooking for others anymore. His wife Mary had died 3 years ago from fever, and since then he had lived alone, eating simple meals that kept him alive but brought no joy. This morning felt different. He was cooking for people who needed him. Samuel made a large pot of oatmeal with dried berries and honey. He fried salt pork in his iron skillet. The smell of cooking food filled the cabin. He heard movement from the small guest room. The door opened slowly and the 2 Apache women appeared. They looked much better than last night. Their faces had color now, and their eyes were clear and alert. "Good morning," Samuel said with a small smile. He gestured to his table. "Please sit and eat." The women looked at each other, then at the food, then back at Samuel. They seemed surprised by his continued kindness. Slowly they came forward and sat at the rough wooden table. Samuel served them generous portions of oatmeal and meat. He poured hot coffee into tin cups. The women ate with good appetite, but also with careful manners. They were not animals, Samuel realized. They had dignity and grace, despite their recent suffering. He ate his own breakfast standing by the fire, giving them space when they finished. The taller of the 2 women spoke to him in Apache. Her voice was deep and strong. Samuel shook his head. "I'm sorry." "I don't understand your language," he said. The woman seemed to think for a moment, then touched her chest and said, "Nasha," she pointed to her sister. "Casa," Samuel understood. They were telling him their names. He touched his own chest. "Samuel," he said. "Samuel Garrett," Nasha nodded. She pointed to the food and then touched her heart. Then she bowed her head slightly. Samuel understood the meaning. She was thanking him. "You're welcome," he said. "You needed help. I couldn't turn you away." Nasha watched his face carefully as he spoke, trying to understand his words through his tone and expression. After breakfast, Samuel examined their injuries in the morning light. Nasha's hands looked bad. The cuts were deep and the frostbite had damaged several fingers. He cleaned the wounds again with warm water and applied a salve made from bear grease and herbs. He rewrapped them in clean cloth. Casa's feet concerned him more. 2 of her toes had turned black from frostbite. Samuel knew she might lose them. He tried to explain this through gestures, pointing to her toes and then making a cutting motion. Casa's eyes widened, but she nodded. She understood the danger. Samuel decided to wait a few days before making any decisions about amputation. Sometimes tissue that looked dead could recover with warmth and time. He had seen it during the war, while the women rested by the fire. Samuel went outside to tend his animals. The morning was brutally cold. His breath froze in his beard. The snow crunched under his boots like broken glass. His horses nickered when they saw him. He fed them hay and broke the ice in their water trough. The cattle were still huddled in their sheltered spot. He counted them carefully, all present, all alive. Samuel noticed tracks in the snow near his fence line. Wolf tracks, maybe a whole pack. They would be hungry in this weather. Desperate enough to attack cattle or horses, he made a mental note to keep watch at night. Losing livestock to wolves would be a disaster. He needed every animal to survive until spring. When he returned to the cabin an hour later, he found something unexpected. The 2 women had cleaned his entire main room. The dishes were washed and stacked neatly. The floor had been swept. His scattered belongings were organized. Even his bed was made properly for the first time in months. Nasha and Casa stood near the fire, watching his reaction. "You didn't have to do this," Samuel said, surprised and a bit embarrassed at how messy his home had been. But he smiled to show he appreciated their work. "Thank you." Nasha smiled back. It was the first time he had seen her smile. It changed her whole face, making her look younger and less frightening. Despite her great size and warrior's build, she suddenly seemed almost gentle. The day passed quietly. Samuel worked on indoor tasks, repairing a broken chair, mending torn clothes, sharpening his knives. The women watched him work with interest. Sometimes they spoke to each other in their own language. Their voices were low and musical. Samuel found the sound peaceful. It had been so long since his cabin held any voices besides his own. In the afternoon, Nasha approached him with a question in her eyes. She pointed out the window at the snowy landscape, then made a walking gesture with her fingers, then pointed to herself and Casa. Samuel understood she was asking about leaving, where they should go, how they could find their people. Samuel thought carefully about his answer. He knew the Apache bands moved with the seasons. In winter, they usually stayed in protected canyons in the mountains. But which canyon, which band did these women belong to? He had no way to know. He made a gesture for them to wait, to stay. Then he pointed at the snow outside and shook his head. Too dangerous, not yet, Nasha seemed to understand. She looked relieved, actually. Traveling in this weather would likely kill them. They needed more time to heal, more time to regain their strength. She nodded and spoke to her sister. Casa also nodded. They would stay a bit longer. That evening, Samuel made a stew from dried venison, potatoes, and wild onions. He had been saving the venison for a special occasion. Though he had never expected the occasion would be feeding 2 Apache women in the middle of winter, the stew was rich and filling. They all ate well. After dinner, something remarkable happened. Nasha began to hum a song. It was low and rhythmic, almost like a chant. Then Casa joined in, harmonizing with her sister. The sound filled the cabin with something Samuel couldn't quite name. It was beautiful but also sad, Like the song carried all the loneliness of winter, all the pain of being lost and far from home. Samuel listened without moving. He felt tears come to his eyes, though he couldn't explain why. Maybe it was because he understood their loneliness. Maybe it was because he had been lonely too for so long. When the song ended, the three of them sat in silence around the fire. Three people from different worlds, brought together by chance and winter before bed. Samuel gave the women extra blankets and made sure their room was warm. He stoked the fire high and checked that the door was barred securely. As he settled into his own bed, he thought about the strange turn his life had taken. 2 days ago, he was alone. Now he was responsible for 2 lives. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know if he was making the right choices, but he knew one thing clearly. He could not have turned them away from his door, whatever came next. Whether trouble or blessing, he would face it. That was what Mary would have wanted. That was what being human required. Outside, the wind sang its cold song. Inside the cabin, 3 people slept. All warm, all fed, all safe for now. Samuel's last thought before sleep took him was simple. Tomorrow he would check their wounds again. Tomorrow they would need more food. Tomorrow would take care of itself. For tonight, kindness was enough. The 3rd day began with unexpected sunshine. Samuel woke to bright light streaming through his cabin windows. He hadn't seen the sun in almost a week. The sight of it made his spirits lift. He rose from bed and looked outside. The world was covered in sparkling white snow that hurt his eyes with its brightness. The sky was clear blue, and icicles hung from the cabin roof like glass spears. In the guest room, Nasha and Casa were already awake. Samuel heard them talking quietly in their language. When they emerged, they looked stronger than before. The rest and food were healing them. Nasha's hands were less swollen, and Casa was walking with less pain. Samuel felt satisfaction at seeing their improvement. He made breakfast again, this time adding precious eggs from his few chickens that still laid during winter. The women's eyes widened at the sight of fresh eggs. Samuel realized they probably hadn't eaten anything fresh in weeks. They had been surviving on whatever dried food they carried. If they had any food at all while they ate, Samuel studied them more carefully. Both women wore traditional Apache clothing, buckskin dresses decorated with beadwork, though much of it was damaged now. Their hair, now dry and brushed, fell long and thick down their backs. They wore it loose, not in the braids he had sometimes seen on Apache women. He wondered what that meant in their culture. Nasha noticed him looking. She didn't seem offended. Instead, she pointed to her dress and made a sewing motion. Then she pointed to the tears and damage. She was asking if he had materials to repair their clothes. Samuel nodded and brought out his wife's old sewing basket. He had kept it all these years, unable to throw away her things. The basket still held needles, thread, and scraps of cloth. Nasha and Casa examined the contents with interest. They spoke to each other. Then Nasha looked at Samuel with a question on her face. She touched the basket gently, reverently, Samuel understood. She was asking if these things belonged to a woman. If that woman was gone, my wife, Samuel said quietly. She died 3 years ago, fever. He didn't know if they understood his words. But his tone carried the meaning. Nasha nodded slowly. Her face showed understanding and sympathy. She touched her heart and then reached out to briefly touch Samuel's hand. It was a gesture of shared grief, of recognizing loss. The moment passed, and the women set to work repairing their clothing. Samuel was amazed by their skill. Their fingers moved quickly despite Nasha's injuries. They created stitches so small and neat that the repairs were nearly invisible. They worked together without speaking. Each knowing what the other needed, Samuel watched them for a while, then decided to go outside and make himself useful. The sunshine had brought the temperature up slightly, though it was still dangerously cold. Samuel needed to check his property and make sure the storm hadn't caused damage. He strapped on his snowshoes and took his rifle. The snow was deep in some places up to his waist, but the snowshoes helped him walk on top. He checked his fences first. Several posts had broken under the weight of snow and ice. He would need to repair them when the weather warmed. For now, he marked their locations in his mind. He checked on his cattle again. They were restless and hungry. He broke open a bale of hay and spread it for them. The animals pushed against each other to reach the food. While working, Samuel noticed something that made his blood run cold. More wolf tracks, many more than yesterday. The pack had circled his property during the night. They had come close to the cattle, close to the barn, close to the cabin itself. He counted the tracks. At least 8 wolves, maybe 10. That was a large pack, dangerous and desperate. Samuel hurried back to the cabin. His mind was already planning. He would need to keep watch tonight. He would need to keep fires burning around his livestock. Wolves feared fire if he could keep them away for a few more days. Maybe they would move on to easier prey. But he couldn't do it alone. He would need help when he entered the cabin. Nasha and Casa looked up from their sewing. They saw his concerned face immediately. Nasha stood up, her expression alert. She said something in Apache that sounded like a question. Samuel tried to explain using gestures. He held up fingers to show many, then made a motion like a running animal, then showed teeth like a snarl. "Wolves," he said, pointing outside. "Many wolves. They're hunting." Casa's eyes widened in understanding. She spoke rapidly to Nasha. Both women looked serious now. They knew the danger. Wolves in winter were killers. They would take cattle, horses, even attack humans if hungry enough. Nasha walked to the window and looked out at the bright snow. She studied the land carefully, like someone reading a book. Then she turned to Samuel and spoke slowly, using simple English words he hadn't known she possessed. "We help," she said. "Tonight, we help." Samuel felt relief wash over him. "You speak English," he said with surprise. Nasha made a gesture with her hand, indicating a little bit, not much. "Some words," she said. "Learn from Trader." Long ago, Samuel realized she had been understanding more than she let on. She had been listening and learning, being cautious. That was smart. They spent the afternoon preparing. Samuel showed the women his barn and the layout of his property. Nasha grasped his plan immediately. They would take turns keeping watch. They would keep fires burning in strategic locations. They would make noise and show light to scare the wolves away. It was simple, but it might work. Casa couldn't walk far on her damaged feet, but she could watch from the cabin window with Samuel's rifle. Samuel was surprised when Nasha showed she knew how to handle the gun. She checked it expertly, sighted down the barrel, nodded her approval. These were not helpless women. They were survivors. Warriors in their own right. As darkness fell, they put their plan into action. Samuel built 3 large fires in a triangle around his livestock. He piled wood high so the fires would burn for hours. Nasha took a position in the barn loft with a clear view of the cattle. She carried a torch and a large stick for making noise. Samuel patrolled between the fires, keeping them fed with wood. The night was crystal clear and bitterly cold. The stars blazed overhead like ice chips. Samuel's breath created clouds that froze on his beard. His feet went numb even in heavy boots. But he kept moving, kept watching. The fires crackled and sent sparks flying into the black sky. Around midnight, the wolves came. Samuel heard them first, howling in the distance, then closer, moving in. He saw their eyes reflecting the firelight. Yellow and hungry, he banged his metal bucket with a stick, creating a terrible noise. From the barn, Nasha began shouting and banging on the wooden walls. The cattle woke and moved nervously. The wolves circled but didn't attack. They were testing, looking for weakness. Samuel threw a burning branch toward the nearest pair of eyes. The wolves scattered but didn't leave. They were patient. They would wait for mistakes, for the fires to die, for the humans to get tired. Samuel looked up at the barn and saw Nasha's silhouette against the fire glow. She was standing strong, alert, watching in the cabin window. He could see Casa's shadow also watching, also ready. 3 people against a pack of hungry wolves, 3 strangers who had become allies. The hours crawled by. Samuel fed the fires. He made noise. He showed himself clearly in the firelight. The wolves tested them again and again, but never committed to an attack. The presence of 3 humans, 3 sets of eyes, 3 sources of noise and movement confused them. They had expected one man, easy prey. Instead, they found organized resistance. As dawn approached, the wolves finally gave up. Samuel heard their howling grow distant, moving away toward the mountains. He felt exhaustion hit him like a physical blow. His legs shook, his hands trembled from cold and tension. But his animals were safe. Everything had survived. Nasha climbed down from the barn loft. She walked to where Samuel stood by the last burning fire. Her face was tired, but she was smiling. "Good fight," she said in her careful English. "No loss." Samuel smiled back. "Good fight," he agreed. They stood together in the growing light, two warriors after battle. When they returned to the cabin, Kesa had hot coffee ready. The three of them sat around the table, too tired to speak, but bound now by something stronger than words. They had protected each other. They had worked together. They had survived the night. Samuel realized something important in that moment. These women were not his burden. They were not helpless victims he was rescuing. They were his partners. They had just saved his livestock, maybe even his life. The debt between them was now balanced. As the sun rose fully and painted the snow pink and gold, Samuel finally allowed himself to rest. He fell asleep in his chair by the fire, knowing that Nasha and Casa were awake and watching, knowing that he was safe in his own home, knowing that sometimes strangers become family in the span of a single night. Samuel woke in his chair with a stiff neck and cold feet. The fire had burned down low while he slept. Pale morning light filled the cabin. He could hear movement in the guest room. The soft sounds of Nasha and Casa preparing for something. Samuel sat up and rubbed his face. His whole body ached from the long, cold night of fighting off wolves. He stood and stretched, then added wood to the fire. The flames caught quickly and began to spread warmth again. Samuel put coffee on to boil and started making breakfast. He was cracking eggs into his skillet when Nasha and Casa emerged from their room. What he saw made him stop and stare. The two women were dressed for travel. Their clothing was repaired, and they wore heavy wraps made from the blankets Samuel had given them. They had fashioned the blankets into Apache-style coats. Their hair was braided now, pulled back tight and practical. They carried small bundles of belongings. They were leaving. Samuel felt an unexpected sadness. He had grown used to their presence in just a few days. The cabin felt more alive with them here, more like a home instead of just a shelter. But he understood. They needed to find their people, their family. They had already stayed longer than was safe for any of them. "You're going today," Samuel said. It was not a question. Nasha nodded. "Must go," she said in her halting English. "Find family." "Tell them of Samuel Garrett." She pronounced his name carefully. With respect, Casa stood beside her sister, silent, but watching Samuel with grateful eyes. Samuel nodded. "Let me make you breakfast first." "And I'll pack food for your journey?" Nasha started to protest, but Samuel held up his hand. "Please," he said firmly. "You need strength for traveling." Nasha studied his face for a moment, then smiled slightly and nodded. They ate together one last time. Samuel made a large meal. Eggs, fried potatoes, the last of his bacon, fresh bread with butter and honey. He wanted them to start their journey with full stomachs. While they ate, Samuel watched them and wondered about their story. How had they ended up lost in the blizzard? Where was their band camping for winter? Did they have family waiting and worried? After breakfast, Samuel packed supplies for them. He filled a canvas bag with dried beef, hardtack, beans, coffee, and salt. He added matches wrapped in oilcloth to keep them dry. He included a small pot for cooking and a sharp knife. It was more than he could easily spare. But he couldn't send them into the wilderness unprepared. Nasha watched him pack with serious eyes. When he finished, she reached out and touched his arm. "Too much," she said. "You need food." Samuel shook his head. "I'll manage," he said. "You have farther to go than me." He tried to make a joke. "Besides, you saved my cattle. This is payment." Casa spoke for the first time that morning. Her English was even more broken than her sister's, but understandable. "You good man," she said slowly. "Apache, remember." She touched her heart, then pointed at Samuel. "We remember." Samuel felt emotion rise in his throat. He wasn't used to gratitude. He had simply done what seemed right, what seemed human. "I'll remember you too," he said quietly. "Travel safe. Watch for wolves." Nasha nodded seriously, then surprised him by pulling something from her bundle. It was a small leather pouch decorated with intricate beadwork. She pressed it into Samuel's hand. "For you," she said. "Medicine. Protection." Samuel opened the pouch carefully and saw it contained dried herbs and something that looked like small carved stones. He didn't understand its purpose, but he understood its meaning. It was precious to her, and she was giving it to him. "I can't take this," Samuel started to say, but Nasha closed his fingers around the pouch. "Must take," she insisted, "for kindness, for life." Her eyes were intense. Samuel realized this was important to her. To leave him with something of value, to balance the debt she felt. He nodded and tucked the pouch into his shirt pocket. Next to his heart, the sun was fully up now. The day was clear but cold. Samuel walked with them to the edge of his property. The snow was still deep, but the women had fashioned rough snowshoes from willow branches. They moved with surprising grace despite Casa's injured feet. These were women who knew how to survive in harsh country. At the property line, they stopped. Samuel pointed toward the eastern mountains. "I think your people might be in the canyon lands that way," he said. "There's water and shelter." Nasha looked where he pointed and nodded. "Yes," she said. "We go there." She extended her hand to Samuel in the white man's custom. He shook it. Her grip was strong and warm, then Casa also shook his hand. Her grip was gentler but no less meaningful. "Goodbye, Samuel Garrett," Nasha said. "Maybe we meet again." "Maybe," Samuel agreed, though he doubted it. The frontier was vast and their worlds rarely crossed peacefully. "Go with God," he added. Nasha tilted her head at this phrase, not quite understanding, but she smiled anyway. "Go with God," she repeated carefully. Then the two women turned and began walking east. Samuel stood and watched them go. Two tall figures moving across the white landscape, their blanket coats making them look like moving mountains. They walked with purpose and dignity, not like victims fleeing danger, but like warriors heading home. Samuel watched until they reached the first ridge and disappeared over it. Even then, he stood for a while longer. Looking at the tracks they left in the snow, part of him wanted to call them back, to tell them to stay until the weather warmed, but he knew that was impossible. They had their own lives, their own people, their own world. Finally, he turned and walked back to his cabin. The building looked small and lonely again. Inside, the warmth felt empty somehow. Samuel made himself busy. He cleaned up from breakfast. He organized his supplies. He tried not to think about the silence. In the guest room, he found the blankets folded neatly. On top of the blankets was a gift he hadn't expected. Nasha had left behind one of her beaded necklaces. It was beautiful work. White and blue beads arranged in a pattern that might have been stars or might have been flowers. Samuel picked it up carefully. The beads were cool and smooth under his fingers. He carried it to his shelf and placed it there next to the photograph of his late wife, Mary. Two women who had touched his life, one through years of love, one through days of unexpected friendship. Samuel looked at both remembrances and felt less alone somehow. The rest of the day passed in normal work. Samuel tended his animals. He repaired the fence posts broken by the storm. He chopped more firewood, but his mind kept drifting to Nasha and Casa. He wondered how far they had traveled, if they had found shelter, if they were safe. That evening, Samuel sat by his fire with coffee and tried to read. But he couldn't concentrate on the words. He kept seeing Nasha's face when she thanked him, Casa's eyes when she called him a good man. He had helped two strangers, nothing more. But somehow it felt like more. It felt like he had done something that mattered. Outside, the wind picked up, blowing snow against the cabin walls. Samuel hoped the women had found shelter somewhere. He hoped they were warm and safe. He touched the medicine pouch in his pocket and said a quiet prayer for their journey. He didn't know it then, but his simple act of kindness had set events in motion that would change his life forever. The two women walking through the snow were not just survivors returning home. They were daughters of a powerful chief, and they were carrying a story that would soon bring a whole Apache band to Samuel Garrett's door. But that night, Samuel knew none of this. He only knew that he had done his best to help two people in need. He had fed them, sheltered them, and sent them on their way with supplies and prayers. If that was all that came of it, it would be enough. He went to bed feeling tired but somehow content. The cabin was empty again. But it didn't feel quite as lonely sometimes, Samuel thought as he drifted toward sleep. Sometimes the greatest gift is knowing that kindness still matters in a hard world. Sometimes just being human is enough. Outside, the stars wheeled slowly across the winter sky. Inside, Samuel Garrett slept, not knowing that tomorrow would bring changes he could never imagine. Not knowing that two grateful sisters were already telling their father about the rancher who saved their lives. 2 days passed quietly after Nasha and Casa left. Samuel fell back into his solitary routine. He woke at dawn, tended his animals, chopped wood, made simple meals, and went to bed when darkness fell. The work was endless, but it kept him from thinking too much. The cabin felt emptier than before. Though he tried not to dwell on it, the weather had turned milder. The sun came out most days and the snow began to melt slowly. Water dripped from the cabin roof and created little streams that ran down the hillside. Samuel knew this warming wouldn't last. February in New Mexico could turn brutal again without warning. But for now, the easier weather was a blessing. On the 3rd day after the women left, Samuel was working on his east fence line. He had his tools spread out on the snow and was replacing a broken post. The work required concentration and strength. He had to dig through frozen ground and set the new post deep enough to hold against summer storms and winter snow. He was hammering the post into position when something made him stop and look up. Maybe it was a sound? Maybe just instinct? Samuel straightened and turned toward the eastern hills. What he saw made his heart begin to pound. A dust cloud was rising in the distance. No, not dust. Snow kicked up by many horses. Many riders were coming toward his ranch. Samuel dropped his hammer and ran. His cabin was a 1/4 mile away. He sprinted through the snow, his breath coming in hard gasps. His mind raced with possibilities. Was it cavalry? Was it settlers? Was it trouble? He had no enemies that he knew of. But on the frontier, trouble often came looking for people who weren't expecting it. He reached his cabin and went straight for his rifle. He checked that it was loaded and grabbed extra ammunition. Then he forced himself to stop and think. If this was an attack, running wouldn't save him. He was one man alone. If they meant him harm, he was already dead. But if they came in peace, greeting them with a gun might be the wrong choice. Samuel took a deep breath and made his decision. He would face them unarmed. He left the rifle inside, but within easy reach. Then he walked out onto his porch and waited. His hands were steady, but his heart hammered in his chest. The riders were closer now. He could see them clearly. There were at least 20 Apache warriors on horseback. They rode in a loose formation. Not like an attacking war party, but not casual either. They were painted and armed, carrying rifles, bows, and lances. At the front rode a man who could only be a chief. He wore a magnificent headdress and sat his horse like someone born to command. Samuel forced himself to stand still, to keep his hands visible, to show no weapon. The riders approached steadily. Their horses' hooves made soft thuds in the melting snow. Samuel could see their faces now, hard faces, warrior faces, eyes that had seen violence and death. These were not men to be taken lightly. When they were 50 yards away, Samuel's breath caught in his throat. Riding on either side of the chief were Nasha and Casa. They were dressed in fine clothing now, clean and decorated. They looked healthy and strong. They had made it home safely. Relief flooded through Samuel. At least they were alive. The group stopped 20 feet from Samuel's porch. The horses stamped and snorted, their breath creating clouds in the cold air. The warriors sat silent and watchful. Their eyes studied Samuel, his cabin, his land. Everything about their posture suggested controlled power. Like wolves deciding whether to attack, the chief dismounted smoothly despite his age. Samuel could see gray in the man's hair and deep lines in his face. This was someone who had lived long and seen much. The chief walked forward with dignity and purpose. Behind him, Nasha and Casa also dismounted. They stayed slightly behind their leader, but their eyes were on Samuel. Samuel stepped down from his porch. He kept his movements slow and deliberate. When he was a few paces from the chief, he stopped. The two men looked at each other, measuring, assessing. The silence stretched out, broken only by the wind and the restless movements of horses. Then the chief spoke, His voice was deep and carried authority. He spoke in Apache, a language Samuel didn't understand. But the tone was not hostile. Samuel waited, unsure how to respond. Then a younger warrior stepped forward. This man wore less decoration but carried himself with confidence. "I am called Running Deer," the young warrior said in clear English. "I speak for Chief Cochilo." He gestured to the older man. "I will translate." Samuel nodded. Grateful for the ability to communicate, "I am Samuel Garrett," he said. "Welcome to my land," Running Deer translated this. Chief Cochilo listened, then spoke again. The translator turned to Samuel. "Chief Cochilo says his daughters have told him a story." Running Deer paused, his eyes flicking to Nasha and Casa. "They say you found them dying in the snow. You brought them to your fire, you fed them and healed them. You protected them from wolves, you sent them home with food and supplies." Samuel felt suddenly self-conscious. "I did what anyone should do," he said. "They needed help." Running Deer translated this. The chief's expression didn't change. He spoke again, more words in Apache. Running Deer translated. "Chief Cochilo says you are wrong. Most men would not help. Most white men would turn Apache women away. Or worse," the chief continued speaking, his voice growing more intense. Running Deer translated carefully. "My daughters are precious to me. They are my blood, my heart. They were lost. I thought them dead. The winter took many of our people this year. I mourned for them. Then they returned. They told me of the rancher who saved their lives." Chief Cochilo stepped closer to Samuel. The old man's eyes were sharp and intelligent. He studied Samuel's face like he was reading a book written there. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. Running Deer translated, "In our way, such a debt must be answered. A life debt is sacred. You saved 2 lives. This cannot be repaid with horses or goods alone." Samuel felt nervous now. He didn't want payment. He didn't want to be in debt to anyone or have anyone in debt to him. "No payment is necessary," he said quickly. "I'm just glad they're safe." But even as Running Deer translated his words, Samuel could see the chief shaking his head. Chief Cochilo spoke firmly. Running Deer's translation was serious. "Among the Apache, honor demands balance. You showed great kindness, great courage. You risked much. In return, Chief Cochilo offers you something precious." The chief turned and gestured. From the group of riders, a young woman came forward leading her horse. Samuel had not noticed her before. She had been in the middle of the group, obscured by the warriors. Now she walked forward, and Samuel could see her clearly. She was young, perhaps 20 years old. She was beautiful in a way that made Samuel forget to breathe. She wore traditional Apache dress decorated with elaborate beadwork. Her long black hair hung loose and shining. She walked with quiet dignity and stopped beside Chief Cochilo. The chief placed his hand on her shoulder with obvious affection. When he spoke, his voice carried pride. Running Deer translated, "This is Helona, my youngest daughter. Her name means fortunate one. She is skilled in medicine, hunting, and all women's arts. She is valued by our people." Samuel's mind was racing, trying to understand where this was going. He had a terrible feeling he knew, but couldn't quite believe it. Chief Cochilo continued speaking, his words formal and ceremonial now. Running Deer translated carefully. "For saving my daughters, for showing honor when you could have shown cruelty. I offer you Helona as your wife. This union will bind our families. It will create peace between your home and my people." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. Marriage. The chief was offering his daughter in marriage. Samuel stood frozen, unable to speak, unable to think. This was impossible. This was insane. He couldn't marry an Apache woman. He didn't know her. They didn't even speak the same language. But as these thoughts raced through his mind, Samuel looked at the faces around him. The chief's face was serious and expectant. Nasha and Casa watched with hopeful eyes. The warriors sat silent but alert. And Helona, the young woman at the center of this, she looked at him with calm assessment. Samuel realized with growing horror that refusing might be seen as a terrible insult. Refusing might destroy the goodwill he had created. Refusing might even put him in danger, but accepting meant changing his entire life. Accepting meant taking responsibility for another person. Accepting meant entering a world he didn't understand. He stood there silent, trapped between impossible choices, while 20 Apache warriors waited for his answer. Samuel's mouth felt dry as dust. His thoughts tumbled over each other like stones in a landslide. He needed time to think, to understand what was really happening here. But 20 pairs of eyes watched him, waiting for an answer to a question that would change everything. He looked at Chief Cochillo and saw a man of absolute conviction. This was not a casual offer. This was something decided with great thought and ceremony. Samuel looked at Nasha and Casa and saw hope in their faces. They believed this was a good thing, an honorable solution. Then he looked at Halona. The young woman stood quietly beside her father. She showed no fear, no embarrassment, no uncertainty. Her face was calm and dignified. She met Samuel's eyes directly. Not with boldness, but with steady confidence. This was a woman who knew her own worth. Samuel realized she was not a prize being given away. She was making a choice too. Samuel started to speak, then stopped. He didn't know what to say. Running Deer watched him with patient eyes. Waiting to translate, Samuel tried again. "This is a great honor," he said carefully. "I am overwhelmed by Chief Cochillo's generosity." He paused, choosing his words like a man walking through a minefield. Running Deer translated. The chief nodded slightly, acknowledging the respect, but his eyes remained fixed on Samuel. Waiting for the real answer, Samuel took a breath and continued, "May I ask a question?" Running Deer translated this. The chief made a gesture that clearly meant yes. "Does Halona wish this?" Samuel asked, looking directly at the young woman. "Does she agree to this arrangement?" It seemed like an obvious question to Samuel, but he saw surprise flash across several faces. Running Deer hesitated before translating as if the question itself was unusual. Chief Cochillo listened to the translation, then turned to his daughter. He spoke to her in Apache, his tone gentle. Halona responded in their language. Her voice was clear and strong. She spoke for perhaps a minute, looking sometimes at her father, sometimes at Samuel when she finished. The chief nodded with what looked like approval. Running Deer translated her words. "Halona says she volunteered for this. Her father did not command it." When Nasha and Casa returned and told their story, the elders discussed how to honor the debt. Halona came forward and said she would be willing to marry the rancher who saved her sisters. He paused, then continued. "She says she sees honor in you. She says a man who helps strangers is a man who will be a good husband." Samuel felt his face grow hot. This wasn't helping. Now he knew she had chosen this freely, which somehow made it harder to refuse. "I am honored by her faith in me," Samuel said slowly. "But I must be honest. I did not save her sisters expecting payment. I did not want anything in return." Running Deer translated this. Chief Cochillo spoke in response, his voice firm. The translator said, "The chief says he knows this. That is exactly why you are worthy. A man who seeks payment for kindness is not truly kind. You acted from your heart. That is why this debt is real and must be answered." Samuel felt trapped. He looked around at the assembled warriors, at the watching faces. He thought about what refusal might mean, not just for him, but for any hope of peace between settlers and Apache in this region. His small act of kindness had grown into something much larger than himself. But there was another thought pushing through his confusion. A thought he almost didn't want to acknowledge. Samuel had been alone for 3 years. 3 years of empty cabin, cold bed, silent meals. He had told himself he was fine with solitude, that he didn't need anyone. But having Nasha and Casa in his home for those few days had awakened something he thought was dead. He looked at Halona again. Really looked at her. She was young, yes, but she carried herself with maturity. She was beautiful. But more than that, her eyes showed intelligence and strength. She was offering herself not out of obligation, but out of choice. She had heard about him and decided he was worth the risk of leaving her people. "May I speak with Halona?" Samuel asked suddenly. "Alone?" Just for a moment, more surprise showed on faces around him. Running Deer looked at Chief Cochillo. The chief considered for a long moment, then nodded once. He spoke to Halona. She nodded and walked toward Samuel. The two of them moved a short distance away, still visible to everyone but out of easy hearing. They stood facing each other. Samuel felt awkward and uncertain. Halona waited patiently, her face open and calm. "Do you speak English?" Samuel asked quietly. "Some words," Halona said, her accent thick but her pronunciation clear. "I learn more." Samuel nodded. That was something, at least. They would be able to communicate. "Why do you really want this?" he asked. "Tell me true." Halona was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she spoke carefully in her limited English. "My sisters say you are kind, you are strong. You are alone." She touched her chest. "I am alone too. My husband died 2 winters past. Sickness." Samuel's eyes widened. She had been married before. She knew what she was choosing. "I have no children," Halona continued. "This is sad for Apache woman. I want family. I want home." She looked directly into Samuel's eyes. "You want family too, I see in your face. We both alone. Maybe together we not alone." Her simple honesty cut through all of Samuel's complicated thinking. She wasn't offering him some romantic fantasy. She was offering partnership, survival, mutual need met with mutual respect. It was practical, honest, and somehow more meaningful than pretty words would have been. "I am not easy man," Samuel said quietly. "I am stubborn. I work hard. I don't talk much." Halona smiled slightly, the first smile he had seen from her. "Apache women like strong, quiet men," she said. "Talk too much is not good, despite everything." Samuel almost laughed. There was humor in her eyes, a spark of personality showing through. "Your father," Samuel said. "He is powerful, chief, if I accept if we marry. What does he expect from me?" Halona seemed to understand the question. "He expect you treat me good," she said. "He expect you be honorable man, like you show to my sisters." She paused, then added, "He expect if trouble come, we stand together. Your people and my people. Peace between us." So there it was. The real truth. This marriage wasn't just about 2 people. It was about building a bridge between worlds that were usually at war. It was about creating a bond that might protect both sides. Samuel would gain a wife, protection from Apache raids, and allies in harsh country. The Apache would gain a trusted white man who could trade, who could warn them of danger, who could speak for them. It was political, practical, and completely overwhelming. But Samuel realized something else. He could refuse. He could send them away. He would probably survive, but he would be alone again. Alone in his cabin, alone with his memories. Alone until the loneliness killed him as surely as any bullet. Or he could say yes. He could take this leap into the unknown. He could trust that 2 people from different worlds might find a way to build something together. It was terrifying, but living afraid was its own kind of death. Samuel looked at Halona's face, at her steady eyes, at the strength in her posture. He thought about her words, about her honesty, about her willingness to risk everything on a stranger. If she could be that brave, could he do less? He took a deep breath and made his choice. "Yes," he said quietly, "I will marry you." Halona's face showed relief and something that might have been happiness. "You sure?" she asked. Samuel nodded. "I'm sure." "I am honored." They walked back to where Chief Cochillo waited. Samuel felt like he was moving through a dream. When they reached the chief, Samuel spoke clearly so Running Deer could translate. "I accept Chief Cochillo's offer with gratitude and respect. I will marry Halona. I will honor her, protect her, and treat her well. I ask only that she be patient while I learn your ways," Running Deer translated. Chief Cochillo's stern face broke into a broad smile. He stepped forward and gripped Samuel's shoulders. The chief spoke, and Running Deer translated with obvious pleasure. "You have made a wise choice. You gain not just a wife, but a family. We are bound now. You are under our protection. Any who harm you harm us." The warriors behind them began to make sounds of approval, some calling out, some raising weapons in salute. Nasha and Casa were grinning widely, clearly delighted their plan had worked. And Halona, she stood quietly with a small smile, looking at the man who had just become her future. Samuel stood there surrounded by Apache warriors, having just agreed to marry a woman he met 10 minutes ago, and wondered if he had lost his mind completely. But when Halona reached out and briefly touched his hand, a simple gesture of connection, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Chief Cochillo spoke rapidly to his warriors, giving orders that Samuel couldn't understand. The men began to dismount, moving with purpose and organization. Samuel watched with growing confusion as they started unpacking bundles from their horses. What was happening? He had agreed to the marriage, but he thought there would be time, days or weeks, to prepare. Running Deer saw Samuel's bewilderment and smiled. "The chief says the wedding will be today," he explained. "There is no reason to wait when a thing is right. It should be done quickly." Samuel felt his stomach flip. Today he was getting married today. He looked at Helona, who seemed completely calm about this. "Today," Samuel repeated weakly, "but I'm not prepared. I have nothing ready." Running Deer translated this, and Chief Cochillo laughed. A deep, booming sound. The chief spoke, and Running Deer translated with amusement. "He says you have a home, you have honor, and you have willing heart. What else does a man need for marriage?" The warriors were busy now. Some gathered wood for a fire, others unpacked supplies. Food and ceremonial items. Nasha and Casa took Helona aside and began preparing her. Samuel stood feeling useless and overwhelmed. This was all moving too fast. His mind couldn't keep up with what was happening. Running Deer touched his shoulder. "Come," he said. "We must prepare you also." He led Samuel away from the main activity. Toward a spot near the creek, two older warriors followed them, their faces serious but not unfriendly. "For Apache wedding? Both man and woman must be clean," Running Deer explained. "You must wash, put on clean clothes." Samuel nodded and went into his cabin. He found his best shirt, the one he wore to town on rare occasions. It was plain but clean and without holes. He washed his face and hands in cold water from his basin. He tried to comb his hair and beard, looking at himself in the small mirror. He looked terrified. When he came back outside, he found the area in front of his cabin had been transformed. A large fire burned in a circle of stones. Around it, blankets and furs had been arranged for sitting. The warriors had created a ceremonial space in less than an hour. Samuel was impressed despite his nervousness. Chief Cochillo stood near the fire wearing full ceremonial dress now. He had added more feathers to his headdress and wore a decorated vest. He looked like what he was, a leader of his people. Powerful and dignified, he gestured for Samuel to approach. Samuel walked forward on legs that felt unsteady. Through Running Deer, the chief spoke. "Among my people, marriage is sacred bond. It is not just between man and woman, but between families. Between worlds." Samuel listened carefully. "Trying to understand and remember everything, the ceremony will blend our traditions with respect for yours. We will honor both ways." Nasha and Casa emerged from Samuel's cabin. They had been preparing Helona inside. Now she walked out and Samuel forgot to breathe. Helona wore a dress of white deerskin decorated with hundreds of blue and white beads. Her hair hung loose and shining. Woven with small feathers and beads, she was absolutely beautiful. She walked to the fire circle with quiet grace and stood across from Samuel. Her eyes met his, steady and calm. In her hands, she carried a small bundle wrapped in soft leather. The chief began to speak in Apache, his voice taking on a rhythmic ceremonial quality. Running Deer translated softly. "We gather to bind these two lives," the chief said. "Samuel Garrett, who showed kindness to strangers, who valued life above fear, and Helona, daughter of my blood, healer and wise woman, who chooses to walk this path with courage." The chief lifted his hands to the sky, speaking words in Apache that Running Deer didn't translate. Prayers or blessings in the old language. Then the chief turned to Helona. "Daughter, do you choose this man freely? Do you promise to honor him, to stand beside him, to share his burdens and his joys?" Helona answered clearly in Apache, her voice strong. Running Deer translated, "She says yes." "She chooses freely." Chief Cochillo turned to Samuel. "Samuel Garrett, do you accept my daughter as your wife? Do you promise to honor her, to protect her, to respect her people and her ways?" Samuel's voice came out rougher than he intended. "Yes," he said. "I promise all of this." The chief nodded, satisfied. He gestured, and Nasha came forward carrying a long strip of soft leather. The chief took it and began wrapping it around Samuel's right wrist, then extended it to Helona's left wrist, binding them together. as this cord binds your hands. So your lives are bound, he said. What is joined here is not easily broken. Halona opened the bundle she carried. Inside was bread she had made herself and dried fruit. She broke off a piece of bread and offered it to Samuel. He took it and ate. The taste was different from his own bread, flavored with herbs he didn't recognize. Then Samuel realized he should do the same. He had nothing prepared. But he reached into his pocket and found a piece of peppermint candy he had bought months ago in town. It was all he had to offer. He felt foolish offering candy at a wedding ceremony, but he unwrapped it and held it out to Halona. She took it, put it in her mouth, and smiled. The warriors around them chuckled, not mockingly, but with warmth. Even Chief Cochilo smiled. Running Deer said, "She has never tasted this. It is new to her, like this marriage is new." Samuel relaxed slightly. Maybe improvising was acceptable. The chief continued the ceremony, speaking more words in Apache. Then he unwrapped the leather binding their wrists. "The cord is removed," he said, "but the bond remains. You are married now in the eyes of the Apache people." He looked at Samuel seriously. "Among your people you may need other ceremony. Other words, we understand this. But here, now, you are husband and wife," Samuel nodded. He would need to find a preacher eventually to make it legal under white man's law, but that seemed less important than this moment. This commitment made before witnesses under the open sky. He looked at Halona, and she looked back. They were married just like that. His life had changed completely. The formal ceremony ended and the atmosphere shifted. Warriors began to relax, talking and laughing. Food appeared, meat roasting over the fire, bread, dried fruits and vegetables, even some kind of sweet cakes. Chief Cochilo pulled Samuel aside, away from the celebration. "My daughter is precious to me," the chief said through Running Deer. "But she is strong. She is not fragile flower. She has survived loss. She knows hardship. She will be good wife if you are good husband." Samuel nodded seriously. "I will do my best," he promised. The chief studied him for a long moment. "I believe you will," he finally said. "That is why I offered her. That is why she chose you." He paused, then continued. "You understand what this marriage means? It is alliance. It is protection for both sides. My people will not raid your cattle. We will trade fairly. We will warn you of danger, and you will be friend to Apache. You will speak truth about us to other white men. You will help when you can." "I understand," Samuel said. He did understand. This was bigger than him, bigger than Halona. This was about survival for both their peoples. "I will honor the agreement," Chief Cochilo gripped his shoulder. "Good," he said. "Then we are truly family now." The celebration continued into the evening. Samuel found himself surrounded by Apache warriors who wanted to meet him, to shake his hand, to welcome him into their circle. Some spoke a little English, most didn't, but friendliness needed no translation. They shared food and drink, told stories through Running Deer's translation, and laughed together. Halona stayed near Samuel, but not clinging to him. She moved through the gathering with confidence, bringing food, speaking with warriors, checking on details. Samuel watched her and felt a growing respect. She was not shy or uncertain. She was a woman who knew her role and played it well. As darkness fell and the stars came out, the warriors began preparing to leave. Chief Cochilo announced they would return to their winter camp. The wedding was done. Samuel and Halona needed time alone to begin their life together. The warriors packed up their belongings, mounted their horses, and prepared to ride. Chief Cochilo embraced his daughter. Speaking to her softly in Apache, Halona nodded. Her eyes bright with unshed tears, Nasha and Casa also hugged their sister, giving her whispered advice and encouragement. Then the chief turned to Samuel. "Take care of her," he said simply. "I will," Samuel promised. The warriors rode away into the darkness, their forms disappearing into the night. The sound of hoofbeats faded slowly until silence returned. Samuel and Halona stood together in front of the cabin, watching them go. Suddenly, Samuel was very aware that he was alone with his new wife, a woman he barely knew. Halona turned to him and smiled. "We begin now?" she said in her careful English. Samuel nodded. "We begin now," he agreed. She took his hand and led him toward the cabin. Toward their new life together, Samuel followed. terrified and hopeful in equal measure, not knowing what would come next, only knowing that everything had changed forever. The cabin felt different with Helona inside. Samuel closed the door behind them and suddenly felt awkward in his own home. The fire still burned from the ceremony outside, casting flickering light through the windows inside. His small lantern created a circle of warm yellow light. Helona stood in the center of the room, looking around with curious eyes. She moved slowly through the space. Examining everything with interest, she touched his table, ran her fingers along the rough wood. She looked at his shelves with their few books and supplies. She studied the photograph of Mary on the mantel, her expression thoughtful but not jealous, just curious about the woman who came before her. "Your first wife," Helona said, pointing to the photograph. It wasn't a question. Samuel nodded. "Mary," he said quietly. "She died 3 years ago." Helona touched her heart in a gesture of sympathy. "You loved her," she observed. "Yes," Samuel admitted. "Very much." Helona nodded. Accepting this. "Good," she said, surprising him. "Man who cannot love is bad husband. Man who loved before can love again." It was simple wisdom. Spoken without jealousy or insecurity, Samuel felt some of his tension ease. Helona wasn't trying to replace Mary. She was starting something new. "You must be tired," Samuel said. Not sure what else to say, the day had been overwhelming. He gestured toward the bedroom. His bedroom, their bedroom now. The thought made his heart race. Helona looked at the room, then back at him. "We talk first," she said firmly. She sat at his table and gestured for him to sit across from her. Samuel sat, grateful for the delay, for more time before facing the intimacy of sharing a bed. Helona folded her hands on the table and looked at him seriously. "We are married now," she said, speaking slowly to make sure he understood her English. "But we are strangers. This is strange for you. Strange for me also." Samuel nodded, relieved she acknowledged it. "We must learn each other," she continued. "Must be patient, must be kind." "I agree," Samuel said. "I want this to work, but I don't know how. I don't know your ways. I don't know what you need." Helona smiled slightly. "I teach you my ways. You teach me your ways. We make new ways together." She reached across the table and took his hand. Her skin was warm and calloused from work, a hand that knew labor and survival. "I am good wife," Helona said without arrogance, just stating fact. "I cook, I sew, I heal sickness, I hunt, I work hard." She paused. "But I am not slave, I am partner. You understand this." It wasn't a question. It was a requirement. Samuel squeezed her hand. "I understand," he said. "I don't want a slave. I want," he paused, searching for words. "I want someone to share the work, share the life." "I've been alone too long," Helona nodded. Satisfied with his answer, "Good," she said. "Then we will be fine." They talked for hours that first night. Helona's English was limited, but she was clever at making herself understood. She told him about her first husband, a young warrior who died of spotted fever 2 winters past. She had loved him, but their marriage was brief. She told him about her skills, her knowledge of plants and medicine, her ability to track and hunt. Samuel told her about his life, about the war he fought in, about building this ranch, about losing Mary. He told her about his cattle and horses, about the challenges of frontier life, about his loneliness. Helona listened carefully, asking questions when she didn't understand, learning about the man she had married. Finally, as the night grew late and the fire burned low, they could no longer avoid the question of sleeping arrangements. Samuel stood awkwardly. "I can sleep in the guest room," he offered. "You can have the bedroom." Helona shook her head firmly. "We are married," she said. "We sleep together. This is proper." But she saw his nervousness and added gently, "Only sleep, we have time for other things. First, we must be comfortable together." Samuel felt a wave of relief and gratitude. She understood his hesitation and wasn't offended. They prepared for bed in shy silence. Helona changed into a simple sleeping shift behind a blanket Samuel hung for privacy. Samuel changed in the main room. When they finally lay down in the narrow bed, they stayed carefully on their own sides, not touching, both staring at the ceiling. "Samuel," Helona said quietly in the darkness. "Yes," he replied. Thank you for saying yes today. Thank you for giving me new chance. Samuel turned his head to look at her. Thank you for taking a risk on a stranger, he said. Helona smiled in the darkness. Maybe we not strangers for long, she whispered. The first weeks of their marriage were an education for both of them. Samuel learned that Helona rose before dawn and moved through the morning with efficient purpose. She took over the cooking immediately, and his meals improved dramatically. She knew herbs and spices he had never heard of. She made bread that was soft and flavorful. She never wasted anything. Helona proved her claims about hunting. She could track animals through terrain where Samuel saw no signs. She could move silently through the forest. She brought home rabbits, turkeys, even a deer. She was a better shot with a rifle than Samuel. Though she preferred her bow for hunting, it was quieter and didn't scare the other animals away. She also began improving the cabin. She sewed new curtains from old fabric. She organized his chaotic supplies into sensible order. She made the place feel like a home instead of just a shelter. Samuel found himself looking forward to returning from his work each day, knowing someone would be waiting. But it wasn't all smooth. They had misunderstandings. Sometimes Helona did things the Apache way, and Samuel didn't understand why. Sometimes Samuel expected things done a certain way, and Helona had different ideas. They argued occasionally. Though the language barrier made arguing difficult and sometimes accidentally funny, one morning Samuel came inside to find Helona had rearranged all his tools. She had organized them by type and function, which made sense to her, but Samuel had kept them in a different order, organized by how often he used them. He was frustrated, she was defensive. They snapped at each other in their respective languages. Finally, Helona said in exasperated English, "You want tools my way or your way?" Samuel stopped and thought, then laughed at himself. "Your way is probably better," he admitted. "I was just being stubborn." Helona relaxed and almost smiled. "Yes, you very stubborn," she agreed. "I noticed this." They both laughed then. The tension breaking. Over time, their relationship deepened. The careful distance between them in bed slowly closed. One cold night, Samuel woke to find Helona had moved against him in sleep. Seeking warmth, he didn't pull away. Instead, he carefully put his arm around her. She made a small content sound and snuggled closer, still asleep. After that night, they stopped pretending to need separate sides of the bed. They would lie together talking in the darkness before sleep, sharing thoughts and dreams. Sometimes Helona would teach him words in Apache. Sometimes Samuel would help her with difficult English phrases. They were learning each other's language in more ways than one, 3 months after the wedding. Samuel woke before dawn to find Helona awake beside him, staring at the ceiling. "What's wrong?" he asked, concerned. She turned to him with an expression he couldn't read. "I think maybe I am pregnant," she said quietly. Samuel's heart seemed to stop, then start again twice as fast. "Are you sure?" he asked. Helona shook her head. "Not sure, but I think maybe yes." She looked at him nervously. "You are happy or not happy?" Samuel pulled her close and held her tight. "I'm happy," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm terrified, but I'm happy." Helona relaxed against him. "I am same," she whispered, "happy and terrified." They lay together in the growing dawn light, holding each other, thinking about the future, about the child that might be coming, about the family they were building. Spring came slowly to New Mexico. The snow melted and revealed brown earth that would soon turn green. Samuel worked his fields while Helona tended a garden she had planted using seeds she brought from her people and seeds Samuel bought in town. She was definitely pregnant now, her belly beginning to show. Chief Cochilo and his band visited twice during those months. Each time they came in peace, bringing gifts and news. They checked on Helona's welfare. They traded goods with Samuel fairly. They were building trust slowly. Other settlers noticed the Apache didn't raid Samuel's land. Word spread that he had protection. Some settlers thought Samuel was a traitor for marrying Apache. Others were simply jealous of his immunity from raids. But a few, the wiser ones, saw what he had created. They began to ask if he could help them trade with the Apache too. If he could help build bridges between the two peoples. Samuel found himself becoming a mediator. A translator not just of language but of culture. One evening in late spring, Samuel and Halona sat on their porch watching the sunset. Her hand rested on her swollen belly. Samuel's arm was around her shoulders. "Are you happy?" Samuel asked her. "Happy you chose this life?" Halona leaned her head against his shoulder. "Very happy," she said, her English much improved now. "Sometimes I miss my people, but I have new family. I have you, soon I have baby. This is good life." She paused, then added, "You are happy,